Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Durán, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
This is the fourth and last episode of the mini-series Office Spaces as Homes. Today, I have the pleasure to talk to Cea Weaver, who in my view is one of the most radical American housing activists working today. In 2019, Cea coordinated a New York statewide coalition to pass what many consider the most progressive housing laws in recent decades. Now, she's an appointee of the state's public advocate in the first New York task force dedicated to figure out what to do with all the vacant office towers and how to facilitate their conversion into housing or other uses. Cea is an effective and subversive anti-capitalist advocate that reminds us that progressive change is possible. Hi, Cea. It's a true honor to have you as a guest in the podcast. First, I need to introduce a bit of the amazing work that you have done over the past years in the housing space. It would be very nice that you would also introduce the type of work and the kind of organization that you work as main organizer at, which is called Housing Justice for All. I understand that it was a state movement between tenants and homeless people, and you decided to start fighting for housing rights and proper housing for everyone. You had over in 2019 a major triumph, which was the passing of what was called the Housing Stability and Tenants Protection Act of 2019. And I wonder if this would be the best way to introduce the type of work that you have been doing to our audience.
Yeah. So Housing Justice for All is a statewide coalition of about 80 grassroots organizations that represent tenants and homeless New Yorkers in the struggle for housing as a human right. I coordinate the coalition, and really what that means is I facilitate conversations and facilitate a network of, people who are doing organizing on the ground in their neighborhoods every single day into an infrastructure that's powerful enough to win statewide policy change in Albany. Probably the best example of what we've been able to do together is the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. That is a piece of legislation that strengthened and expanded New York State's rent control laws and tenant protection laws. So everything from rolling back loopholes that the real estate industry had put in the system that were causing rent control to disappear in New York City, to expanding rent control to cover the whole entire state, to changing the rules about how evictions happen, to give tenants more power, to fight back against this horrible displacement this horrible displacement that we really think is about power.
According to you, who are you going against? I mean, is it government? Is it developers? Is it a combination of both? I mean, how complicated your enemy is when you are developing all of these campaigns and trying to push, in this case, for changes in the law?
Well, I really think that our enemy is the landlord class and developers, yes. The sort of class of people who own property is not monolithic. So that's something that we can talk about. I'm sure it's something we will talk about. But I really think that that's our opponent, right? Our opponent is landlords and property owners who want to see profit come out of their real estate that they own. And the state is really just the terrain on which we are organizing and struggling. New York State is home to a really storied tenant movement, and I'm sort of proud to continue in that tradition of tenant organizers organizing rent strikes, home to the first and strongest rent control system in the country. We've had rent control in New York State for almost over 100 years, longer than any other place in the country. And our tenant movement is big and it is strong. And it is historic, and I'm happy to be a part of it. At the same time, New York is also home to Wall Street. It is home to the most expensive real estate in the country. And really our tenant protections and the political situation in Albany is really the product of these two organized groups of people confronting each other. And that's how we think about it in Housing Justice for All. So at the same time, as we have really strong rent control, we also know that real estate is every single year the biggest donor to politicians in Albany, and they every single year try to manipulate our political system so that it serves them. And we know that, they've been really successful at doing that in a myriad of different ways.
Now that you explain a bit of the conditions of New York State, we get a lot from our audience that why are you guys always talking about New York when you talk about housing, right? And it's very difficult to explain that for many of us that work in the housing space, New York becomes the pinnacle of development of some kind of rent protections and affordability in historically speaking, tenant movements and so on. Because of its density, it has a quite unique characteristic. But saying this, do you see what has happened in New York, especially during your campaigns, and what is going on right now after the pandemic and so forth, as something that we could learn from it in different cities and different states, even different countries?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Housing Justice for All is a statewide coalition, so that means that we organize with tenants in Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, the Hudson Valley, Syracuse. So places that look a lot more like the rest of the country than New York City does. And so I like to remind people that we're not just organizing tenants in New York City. Beyond that, I think that there's a lot of parallels to what we've been able to do in New York to the rest of the country. First of all, New York is a little bit of an experimental testing ground for some strong public policies that have taken off across the country. We have been able to hang on to our public housing in New York while the rest of the country has turned away from it. And now as organizers are looking to do things like repeal the Faircloth Amendment and start to build new public housing all over the country, we have lessons from what we've been able to do in New York by hanging on to our public housing here, for example. And the same is true for rent control. So in the 1990s, 36 states made rent control illegal. Now organizers in places like Illinois or Florida are trying to or Pennsylvania are trying to overturn bans on rent control and implement rent control policies. We know a lot about fighting for rent control because we've been fighting to protect our system and expand it for so long here in New York. The other thing I would say is that while New York City is a city of renters, 70% of New York City rents, that's not only for New York City. In cities across our state are becoming majority renter, and those cities are also facing housing crises because they're facing crises of affordability, and the more people are renting, the more what we have been able to experiment with in New York is going to be relevant across the country. New York City is not the only unaffordable place to live. New York City is not the only place where tenants don't have strong enough rights. So I think we have a lot to share.
Now that you mentioned that there's people organizing in Florida, I cannot help but think the moment I had Andrew Ross speak about his recent book on housing in Florida, about how like many of the people that are not considered renters, now they're actually renting motels, for example, and short stay housing, which for many of us, that would be considered renting. And that puts Florida in a situation, the amount of people that are renting in short stay. And then you could see a lot of these terrible trends all over the United States here and happen. Now, that to say that recent numbers in New York City in terms of homelessness, I was struck, it was 2 weeks ago, the New York Times had this article about the amount of children that go to schools that are considered homeless. You're talking about 104,000 children, and that was last year. And with many changes in the housing situation this year, I assume that has grown considerably. And you have something that you've been talking a lot about during your campaigns, that 50% or more of New Yorkers cannot afford the rent. And I think this is similar to what you're saying. This is a situation that is all over the United States. You have 50% of New Yorkers that cannot afford the rent. You have corporate landlords, as you just mentioned, like completely taking over the whole space of housing, legal issues, laws, and so forth. And then you have a government that has been very much in favor of that landlord class that you're talking about. In many ways, the city represents, or the region, let's put it that way, represents a lot of or densifies a lot of the issues that the whole country is facing. And I would extend it to many parts of the world. Now, within those numbers, what are in your campaign structures, I mean, the things that you have been focusing the most?
The homelessness crisis is completely out of control for a number of factors. First, we've seen a total unraveling of the social safety net, both at the federal level and then at the state level, and of course at the city level. So we've seen just a real decline in the amount of like social services that people can get access to, and that's caused a real explosion in homelessness in our city and our state. The numbers of homeless children is absolutely staggering, and it's causing, of course, problems with our state's education system, problems with all sorts of other, if you don't have stable housing, it's going to touch every other aspect of your life. And it's heartbreaking. When it comes to solutions, Housing Justice for All is working really on two things. The first is we are working on a sort of rapid rehousing demand to really quickly get rental assistance money in people's hands so that they can get housing in our currently completely broken market. The truth is that rental assistance isn't going to really solve the underlying problem, right? The underlying problem is a housing market that doesn't work. Nonetheless, we need to urgently get people out of shelters and into housing. And that's again, like, that's a question of, that's just a question of like, it's the right thing to do. It's like, we have to do that. And also it's a question of power, right? You're housed, you can organize. If you are unhoused, you can organize, but you face a lot more barriers, right? So we're looking to really quickly house people who are right now living in shelters, and we see that as like first priority. When you have a lot more people paying their rent with rental assistance, we also see that as a sort of organizing juncture that we can organize people around. You can organize voucher holders to demand better living conditions. You can use the fact that the government is paying rent as leverage in an organizing campaign, and we want to transform that into a social housing program for the United States and for New York. So we really do think that one of the issues with rental assistance and with vouchers, as are currently constituted, is that, if you are living in a 8-unit apartment building, let's say, and 7 people pay their rent with their money and 1 person pays their rent with a voucher, and that tenant association tries to go on rent strike, it's really hard for that voucher holder to participate in the rent strike. So we're like seeking, because, you're not in control of whether or not your rent is being paid. Someone else is paying that rent. So we're like looking to see both the sort of rapid rehousing that we need to see happen, but also the changes to the housing subsidy system that will allow people to really organize for power in their home, which is what we think the underlying problem here is.
One of the things in your campaigns, you talk about, we're fighting for the right to remain. And on that, you're focusing on good cause eviction. And good cause eviction has been in the news. People might have heard about that terminology. Can you explain what exactly is good cause eviction and how does that have to do with the right to remain?
Yeah, so in simplest terms, good cause eviction is the right to fight back against rent increases, and it's the right to stay in your apartment and challenge an eviction. So right now, a landlord can evict you for any reason they want. They can just say, hey, this is my apartment. I think it's time for you to go. And you can stay, and you can choose to challenge that in court, but you are likely going to lose because the law is fully on the side of the landlord and the property owner. What good cause eviction does is it lists basically like 8 reasons why your landlord should be allowed to terminate your lease. And those are the only reasons. So it's like a roadmap for renewal leases and how they're meant to happen. It considers, when defining eviction, it considers a rent increase above the consumer price index to be a as good as an eviction, basically. So you could treat a very large rent increase like an eviction and fight back against it in the same way.
Adding to these, you've been also fighting for something that you call in your campaigns as to eliminate homelessness. And for these, you're targeting a very specific program that is called the Housing Access Voucher Program, or HAVP. What exactly is that Housing Access Voucher Program, and how are you trying to utilize it or expand it?
The Housing Access Voucher Program is really simple. It's a rental assistance program for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And one of the things that we are really excited about it is that it would be the first rental assistance program that undocumented people and people who are otherwise ineligible for federal rental assistance could get access to. So in that way, it really expands the size of the people who are able to benefit from the state's rental assistance programs as they currently exist. That's all that it is. We designed it in order to be easier to access than some of our existing rental assistance programs. So when you talk to tenants about vouchers and paying their rent with vouchers, what people hear in their head is oh my God, paperwork. Oh my God, I have to go down to a government building. It's going to be horrible. I'm going to have to give over all of this information about my family and my children and my niece and my nephew and my uncle who lives 4 states away. And just endless bureaucracy and confusion and things that don't really work. Housing Access Voucher Program is designed to be really simple to get, really simple to use, really simple to stay on. It's just money to pay the rent. That's all that it is. And it has broad eligibility and it's sort of designed to have ease of access. Of course, a lot of that happens in implementation, but we really tried to design it based on the idea that simple is better, both for getting resources in people's hands and for getting people to have a good experience of paying their rent, and no one's going to have a great experience paying the rent.
No.
But not all vouchers are created equal. And that's sort of part of what we are saying here.
As a third thing that you have in your campaigns, something that you mentioned is social housing for all. And this is terminology that a lot of Americans have always been fighting against, just to include the idea of social housing or the idea of social behind housing. Normally we refer to housing here as public housing. You decide to name it something else, but then you are working in something that is called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or the TOPA. Can you explain what is this Tenant Opportunity to Purchase?
Yeah. So we define social housing in our coalition as housing that is safe, stable, beautiful housing, publicly funded, resident controlled, and deeply affordable for everyone. So it's housing that is in the public sector. It's housing where residents have a meaningful say over what happens there, how in decision-making, where you live. And it's permanently held right in that public sector and run not for profit. It's decommodified. We think that's actually different than public housing, right? Because public housing in New York, people have this experience of being fully defunded. There's an experience of being over-policed. There's an experience of being alienated from making decisions where you live. And so while public housing maybe meets the characteristic of being fully public and fully decommodified, it doesn't necessarily meet those characteristics of being resident controlled and beautiful and robustly affordable and whatever, all of those things. And so when we say social housing, we think about social housing really as a spectrum, right? Housing can be more or less social. Public housing is social in some ways and not so social in other ways. And the same is true for things like shared equity cooperatives, community land trusts, not-for-profit housing associations, those kinds of things. So we think of social housing as the spectrum, right? And we are trying in our campaigns in Housing Justice for All to move sections of the housing closer towards a fully public, fully decommodified, fully funded, resident-controlled side of the equation. So rent control does that, right? We believe that rent control changes the speculative value of an entire class of properties by telling landlords how much they're allowed to raise their rents and introducing a public decision-making process where residents can organize and demand smaller rent increases or even rent reductions. So rent control helps to socialize housing. public housing helps to socialize housing. And along this vein, so social housing is like a frame or a way that we evaluate and understand different sections of the housing market in the United States for us. And in this vein, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act is a tool that we are fighting for that would help further socialize existing buildings where tenants are organizing. And so if it passed, tenants would have the right to intervene when their landlord wants to sell the building. Already, this would give tenants a lot more power, because one of the things that we've experienced is you're organizing a tenants association, you're suing your landlord, you're going on a rent strike, you're refusing to comply with the things that they want as a means of exercising your economic power over the landlord. The landlord has this exit valve. They're just going to be able to go to the bank or go to some other landlord on the street and say, wow, I own this gorgeous building in Crown Heights. And that other guy is like, Crown Heights, wow, gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn. Like, that sounds great. I'm going to give you like $5 million for that housing. And so it has like the sale, the point of sale is this moment where rent strikes are fully undermined and the tenant association has to like start over from scratch. So Tenant Opportunity to Purchase says, you want to sell the building, you got to offer it to the tenants first. And that's sort of how we think about it as building tenant power. Then we exercise our TOPA rights. And then there's this whole other process that starts about what type of housing do we want to become? Do we want to become a not-for-profit community land trust? Do we want to become a shared equity cooperative? Do we want to become public housing? We have the right to assign our TOPA rights to a public housing authority if we wish. So it creates this other opportunity for tenants to self-determine what type of housing they want to be. Nonetheless, it doesn't allow tenants to choose private homeownership that's not in the TOPA bill. There are other homeownership models. There's a limited equity cooperative model, which allows the tenants to own the building as a collective. But what the TOPA bill does is when a building is sold through a TOPA transaction, the housing is reset into, there's essentially the building, the sale includes a deed restriction. So that building will now be permanently affordable and part of this sort of social sector. And that's how we're envisioning it, really as a tool to do two things. The first is to strengthen tenants' power at the tenant association level. And the second is to create more affordable housing options along a spectrum of social housing.
Oh, it sounds wonderful, Cea. What steps are you taking in order to implement TOPA Act? What are you facing as you try to do it?
Yeah, I mean, TOPA is really interesting because I think a lot of people hear TOPA who maybe don't share our political analysis and our analysis of capitalism, and they're like, oh, great, homeownership, I was talking the other day with some organizers in England, and they were like, right to buy? What? Like they, because they have this experience of sort of Thatcher era right to buy programs, which were really horrible for the public housing program in the UK. So TOPA is interesting because some people hear it and they think, wow, like that's great. Like we totally support that, more homeownership. And so really what we are focused on doing is we are focused on, so we don't want to win TOPA tomorrow, because we think if we win it tomorrow, having not done the work to build the support for TOPA as we believe it will happen, it will be a version of TOPA that doesn't look like what I just described. Mm-hmm. So that means that our work is going out to buildings, knocking on doors, forming tenants associations, identifying buildings that would be a good candidates for TOPA as we envision it, doing teach-ins, working out what the financing is going to look like so this housing is actually affordable for working class people, but isn't saddled with the same problems of housing finance that a lot of other affordable housing programs are. So really the stage that we're at with TOPA is mass education and base building. We're talking to legislators. We are bringing tenant associations to talk to their legislators. And we are really trying to really proselytize what we think this program could look like and why it's so important.
Absolutely wonderful. And you have something else that you have been working on, I think that extends into these, which was called expanding our housing our neighbors and with dignity Act, and then you also put as Honda. Is it related, or how would you differentiate that act from this other act? How do they work together?
Yeah, Honda is to Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. Honda is not a car. It is a housing bill. We actually passed Honda last year or 2 years ago, and I think of Honda sort of as like a mini TOPA. It sort of helped us understand what we need to be able to do to win TOPA in the way we want to win it. It is really targeted at a segment of the real estate market, and that segment is distressed commercial buildings that are out of use or sort of financially underwater for any number of reasons. But the reason we were able to pass that bill in 2021 is because it was speaking directly to this period of the pandemic when commercial office buildings and hotels were sitting empty while our homelessness numbers skyrocketed. So the Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act is really about converting vacant commercial buildings into low-income housing. And the housing that is created through Honda is not-for-profit owned. It is 50% set aside for people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and it is 100% affordable to people below 50% of the median income, and it's permanently rent stabilized. So we haven't done any deals with Honda yet. So there's still money sitting in the state budget ready to be used, but I know some projects are working their way through the development pipeline, and we're hopeful that we're going to see some Honda-ified buildings soon.
Yeah, no, this is great to have a relational sort of understanding of all the things that you're working at the same time, right? From the right to remain, eliminate homelessness, social housing for all, and all of these acts that you are putting together to, I guess, work in unison. I mean, you seem to have quite a dialectical or relational view of what needs to be done in there. But you enter with the Honda Act into the main topic of our conversation today, but it was so important for me that our audience understood the broad work that you are doing, right? And now that you are, I guess, asked to be a member of a task force, which talks to those vacancies and those underutilized buildings that were available that you were talking about, the Honda Act, but now it's something that is bigger. In May of this year, the mayor of New York City, together with the governor, first launched this program that they called the New York Blue Ribbon Panel on New York City's region economy. And this had to do to figure out ways of rescuing the economy after the pandemic shock. And they decided to put as co-chairs the CEO of Robinhood and the CEO of Google's ex-CEO of Google's Sidewalk Lab. Robinhood, for those of you that don't recall hearing about it, is this organization that sells small shares to people that cannot afford stock. Has been involved in many scandals. Sidewalk Labs from Google was Google's attempt over the last 10 years to develop an urban office so that they could expand what they would call smart cities into different parts of the world. They failed with a huge project they were doing in Canada, in Toronto, and people organized against it, and they basically lost millions and millions, and they kicked them out. But it's very telling, right, when you have the mayor and the governor choose these two people as co-chairs of something that's going to talk about the region's economy in the future. It is said that after these, they were going to complement these with another task force, which is called the New York City Adaptive Reuse Task Force. And supposedly, according to all the readings I've done about these task forces, they're supposed to, be in unison, like talk to each other. I don't even know you're going to tell us here. But it turns out that the public advocate chooses you as a representative to be in this task force. You are together with 12 experts. City council speaker decided these, and the mayor decided who are going to be there, and planning director, and so on and so forth. How is that, Cea? I mean, like coming from this organizing, you being chosen by the public advocate to represent these, and then you're suddenly thrown into this panel of experts that I guess mimic a bit the CEO of Robinhood and, Dan Doctor of
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that everything that you described is like not particularly unique. For centuries, cities have been like places where capital is organizing itself. Like that's always been true. And it's not like, now we have, so urban planning really is always been well, maybe not always and everywhere, but at least in the United States, it's like these giant firms that are sort of plotting out the city in their image, and their image is really an image that's like designed to benefit capital. So I went to planning school at NYU, and one of the things I learned in planning school is that the people who are like making big decisions about what our cities look like and feel like are overwhelmingly not people that we elected. They're overwhelmingly people who like won a request for proposals or something like that to take a bunch of public money and like build a neighborhood with it. And some of the money is public, but not all of it. The line between public and private in the United States is incredibly blurry. At the New York City level, it's really, really, really blurry. And so you get the sort of thing that you land with is something that looks like Hudson Yards or, Barclays Center in New York City, where the entire project is facilitated by public money, but there's a lot of private money in there. And the project is meant to sort of encourage private accumulation of capital. It's not always large capital firms. It's often small businesses. And that's sort of like its additional complication of how urban planning ends up happening. And it's like you have Google, and Google wants to create like tons of different little neighborhood cafes that, Google employees can go and shop at. And so like lots of different people are benefiting at lots of different points of exchange, I suppose. And so that's just sort of like something that's been true about urban planning forever. And so the office reuse task force, I would say that I feel very much like a fish out of water in the task force, but I'm doing my best. We haven't met with the blue ribbon panel, so I'm not really sure. There hasn't been like extensive conversation there. But I can say a little bit about what the task force is, and why I found it to be a valuable space, even if I feel like a little bit, in over my head.
Yes.
So New York City has a huge supply of office space, and that office space doesn't all look the same. You have like giant Class A luxury office buildings with doormen and with like all these amenities, gyms and roof decks and blah, 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 fancy office buildings. You also have sort of smaller, older office buildings in commercial districts. You have like a lot of basically empty space that is just sitting around in some of like really like valuable areas with really valuable land, but also where there's like a crazy housing crisis. But these buildings are not necessarily easy to convert to residential for a lot of really important reasons. The fire code is different in residential buildings. The egress is different in residential buildings. There needs to be a way for people to safely exit. The floor map looks different. Like, I don't want to live, the ceilings are lower in office buildings than they are in residential buildings. I don't want to live in an office. There's all of these sort of different things. And so the goal of the task force is to figure out which of these buildings make sense sort of physically and financially to convert into residential options, and how can as much of that be affordable housing as possible if that's a goal of ours. Residential real estate is a lot more valuable than commercial real estate, and it's in some ways harder and in some ways easier to build. So for example, one of the things that we're talking about is like, how do you make it easier? How do you like reduce regulatory barriers to residential conversion, but not do so in a way that encourages sort of bad faith development of an office building? So if it's easier for me to maybe a building is in a commercial zone, and so I am a crazy rich landlord and I'm just going to go build an office building there, and then I'm not going to try to rent it out at all. And I might just go to the Department of City Planning and say, hey, I'm having a lot of trouble renting out this office building I just built. I'd like to convert it to residential under this new program that Mayor Adams created. You don't want to create a backdoor around the zoning code, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be thoughtful about the potential for bad faith conversions from office to residential. So while it seems to make a lot of sense to convert a lot of these empty office buildings into residential, you kind of don't want the brand new Class A buildings to convert because you're giving the wrong incentives to the private market, for example. So that's like one of the things that we've talked about. There's lots of other things that we've talked about as well. The thing that I do just want to like point out here is that there is a long history of New Yorkers living in buildings that were not meant to be lived in, and figuring out a way to convert them into residential spaces. So like lots of the lofts, for example, Soho, Williamsburg, there's like a long history of New Yorkers doing that themselves. So people squat in lofts, and then over time, the housing law has adapted to the fact that people are living there, and there has been a rent regulation scheme and sort of safety and code schemes that have been able to turn loft spaces where people were living into safe live workspaces, and that's been really fraught. And this is different because it's like these are just empty office buildings. No one is organizing themselves into living there right now. And that makes it like a little bit, it doesn't have the same flavor as the long battle over the loft organizing.
I mean, one of the also weird or like the strange things about this process is that it seems to me that most of the conversions are, as you say, being organized by landlords and as a way to extract more value from what they have. As part of this organizing, what I have seen, at least in many cities around the United States, and I assume that is mimicked here with the attempts, is that the conversion of these office towers into residential tend to fall more into the luxury housing, rubric, and the luxury housing sort of idea. Downtowns that are announcing, for example, I was reading the other day an article in Calgary, Canada, and they were saying, yes, we're happy because we have supported for public money these developers to turn into this housing, and the first thing that you read there's going to be luxury housing now. And it seems that within that idea, there's a promotion from the side saying, okay, people need housing. We know there are homeless people. We know that there's a need for housing all over the place. But nevertheless, what I have seen and what I've been reading for, it targets more into that luxury housing speculative realm. Is this something that you have been also faced as you listen and you were part of this task force?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the top priority is conversion to residential and figuring out where that makes sense. And affordability is a secondary concern for the task force. That being said, it's like a primary concern for me. So I'm happy to be there and learn and take what I can take and help. And I hope it will help both inform what the task force eventually ends up doing, but even if not, inform like our organizing and advocacy outside of that, right? It is just like a really interesting exercise in seeing how people really see the role of city government in facilitating the private sector, which is a different perspective than we have. But it's interesting. I mean, it's important to learn about the limitations, right? The city of New York is not prepared to start building new housing tomorrow. So everything is about trying to figure out how we regulate and both incentivize and regulate the private sector. And I'd like to get out of a world where that's like the decision and the thinking that we have to go through.
Absolutely. Part of the speculation I have done in the previous podcast was to argue that office spaces, the way we know it, are over. The loss of office spaces is something that will be permanent, simply because of the work from home, or the hybrid work type of scenarios. I wonder if part of that idea that is lost forever comes out also in the appointment from the city, in this task force, and from the people that are there. Are the discussions inside of this task force leading into the idea that the city has changed forever?
Overwhelmingly, the fear out of the task force is like, are we going to do too much residential conversion? Because like companies want their employers at work. I don't know if they see that as a way to do social control. There's like a strong directive from the mayor that we want people to go to Midtown Manhattan so that we can be working in offices and like shopping in all the stores, I think that there's also all like this sort of like Michael Bloomberg and like Facebook and Google, like tech company stuff on like, we're designing open office floors so that we can just do like creative economy and people run into each other at the office cooler. And that's how we like disrupt the economy or whatever. So I don't know. I think that like I think that people want workers to go back to the office. I don't really know how much workers want that.
Yeah.
Certainly.
They're fighting. And do you see the same, Cea, in places like Albany or Buffalo, right? I mean, New York City, I always see it as a place that creates the density for this CEOs and for the large headquarters of large multinationals that you could actually see spaces being used here. But do you see the same in smaller cities, right, where the buildings there were subsidiaries or there were, smaller sort of extensions of companies?
Yeah, I think so. I think you definitely see the same thing in smaller cities. You also see just like commute patterns are different in smaller cities. People are driving, they're not taking the train. There's different infrastructure concerns. And there's also like less office space, just in general. And there is more vacancy prior to the pandemic. So there has been like a struggle in parts of like Western New York, for example, to have mixed use commercial residential neighborhoods. And so things like look a little bit different. There's like a different type of economic distress.
I see.
But still the same pressures of gentrification, rising rents, and not sure what to do with like real estate in like the central business corridor.
But if New York City decides to enact some kind of law in order to permit an easy conversion of offices into residential and so forth and so on, which it appears that might be the situation in the coming years, what kind of campaign would Housing Justice for All do? I mean, what kind of work would you do in that space if this is opened?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would probably look back to Honda and what we were able to do there. The priorities for us in Honda, that the housing prioritized people who are currently unhoused, that the housing prioritized not-for-profit and public sector housing ownership models, and that the housing be permanently affordable and rent stabilized. So I think we would look back to our social housing definition and continue to use it to evaluate what kind of housing is created by a conversion law and react to whatever proposal using that rubric or using that definition as a rubric.
Lastly, I have something else that I would want to ask you. Why are you doing all of this? What is your ultimate dream? What ticks your belly and what do you want to achieve?
I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is a plurality Black city in Western New York. It is deeply segregated. And when I was very young, I understood that the housing market is a driver of economic inequality and racial injustice in this country. So that was just an early formative experience for me. I then, graduated from college at the height of the foreclosure crisis and tried to get a job and, struggled to get a job, ended up getting a job doing housing organizing. And I really think that for me, those two experiences just early on really helped to me understand that the housing crisis and the housing market, even when it's successful, right, is holding back democracy in this country. It is driving economic inequality in this country. It is driving racial injustice in this country. And we have to unravel. You have to become a homeowner to not die in poverty in this country. To me, it's like the foundational sin of America is homeownership and this whole thing. So that's what we're trying to unweave.
Fantastic, Cea. Thank you very much. It was wonderful having you.
Wonderful to be here. Talk to you soon.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening and don't forget to subscribe.